First off, this is going to be filled with spoilers. So if you haven't actually seen Squid Game and you want to watch this very disturbing show and you don't want to know what's about to happen, then you really shouldn't watch this review until after you've actually watched the show. The basic premise of Squid Game is essentially Hunger Games crossed with Parasite. That's the elevator pitch. It's basically a guy who is living in poverty. He is divorced. He has a bad relationship with his ex-wife. He's kind of a derelict. He's a gambler. And he's fallen into tremendous amounts of debt with a gang, with some sort of mob. And he eventually is approached by a man in a subway station who decides to play a game with him. And the stakes of the game are that if he loses, then the man gets to slap him in the face really, really hard. And if he wins, then the guy gives him money. So this goes on for a few rounds. He keeps losing and losing and losing. Finally, he wins some money. And the guy hands him a card and says, if you want to play more games like this, then let me know. He, of course, decides that he's going to call the number. He ends up being kidnapped, sort of, and taken to a place where they play these children's games. And there are going to be 6 rounds of the children's games. And if you make it through all 6 rounds, then you win this massive pot of money. What they don't tell you is that if you lose the games, then you die. So the very first episode, you have them play red light, green light, and everybody who moves during the red light phase of the game is immediately shot by snipers to death. The first episode is not particularly gory, but it is kind of disturbing in that, very much like Battle Royale, the Japanese precursor to Hunger Games or Hunger Games itself. As the show goes on, the games become more and more scary. You have a couple of other characters who are introduced. You have a young woman who's escaped from North Korea, who's essentially attempting to win the money so that she can give the money to a trafficker to get her mom out of North Korea, and also so that she can afford to buy a house with her younger brother. You have a mob member who is attempting to pay off his bad old debts. A crazy woman whose backstory you don't actually really get. You have a friend of the man, and there's this old man who's tagging along because he has brain cancer and he figures I may as well win some money for my family before I die. In one episode, the people are actually allowed to be let go because the rules of the game are, once you sign up, you have to play. If you don't play, you get shot. But if a majority of the players at any given time decide that they no longer want to play the game, then the entire game is disbanded and the money that was collected for the game is distributed to the families of the people who died. So in an early episode, that's one of the things that happens. Everybody sort of goes back to their regular life. And then, of course, they end up coming back to the game because they have no options in the outside world. And this really brings us to the central sort of parasite aspect of Squid Game. It is a dystopian thriller. And so the politics are very communistic in nature. The politics for this very large budget show, which is being shown on Netflix, which is a high market cap tech company, are extraordinarily far to the left. The basic idea is that capitalism provides so little opportunity that you would rather play a game where you might get shot just to make money than attempt to live out your life in the regular world. Main character, who again is sort of a derelict and a gambler, his mom is trying to live a normal life, but she's got diabetes and she doesn't have enough money to pay for her surgical care, so she might lose her feet, for example. You have the mother of the guy who is corrupt and embezzling, and she runs like a very small stand, but is obviously living in some form of poverty. You have the North Korean escapee who is basically almost homeless and who is forced to steal money. And there's a scene where the North Korean escapee is asked by another character, you escaped from North Korea, was it worth it? And the answer seems to be not really, which is kind of a strange take because North Korea is a giant gulag. It's a giant prison camp. So no matter what you think of South Korea, it is not comparable in any way, shape, or form to the lifestyle in North Korea, where people are on average several inches shorter than people in South Korea because of malnutrition. Also, if you make a show criticizing the regime in South Korea, it goes viral and ends up on Netflix. If you create a show criticizing the regime in North Korea, they strap you to the front of an anti-aircraft gun and then open fire. So that seems to be a slight difference. But the basic idea here is the same as the basic idea in Parasite, which is that if you are poor in South Korea, there is no way up the ladder because capitalism is evil. And there are a bunch of kind of notes that are put into the show that underscore this very silly theme. One of those notes is that when you get to the ending episodes and you find out who are the VIPs who bet on who is going to win and who's going to lose the game, they're all American. Like, they're all these big American fat cats, so it's really the evil Americans and their capitalist excesses, these decadent Americans who are behind this whole thing. There's not a good American in the entire show. They're just a bunch of Americans who are wearing these glittery masks, a la Hunger Games. And this is supposed to characterize the idea that really South Korean economics is run at the behest of these evil white corporate paymasters. The biggest spoiler, of course, is that the person who's heading up the Squid Game is the old man, right? So the old man is playing, and it turns out that he's playing out of fun. He's not actually playing because he is worried about dying. He does have brain cancer, that part's true, but he's the head of a major corporation. He's a very wealthy industrialist, and his entire shtick is that all of this is justified. Squid Game is justified because it is in fact more fair than the actual capitalist economy that is in place in South Korea. Okay, this is a very silly view of capitalism. Capitalism is literally predicated on the notion that you do not get something unless you give something to somebody else. Okay, as Hayek was fond of suggesting, the basic premise of capitalism is that you are forced to do something you wouldn't have normally done for somebody else because you need something from them. Trade ennobles. Trade is good. But for people who don't understand capitalism and come from sort of a Marxist-leaning bent, capitalism is a zero-sum game. Somebody wins and somebody loses. Somebody wins the big pot of cash and somebody dies. Of course, the metaphor inside the Squid Game is supposed to be that if only the population seized the means of production through majority votes, then all of this would end and we would usher in a new and better world, right? All it takes is a majority vote to stop this terrible system where some people are being murdered for the benefit of other people. Okay, but that assumes that economics is a zero-sum game, right? Which it is not. The sort of capitalist critique rings pretty hollow and doesn't have a lot of support other than sort of the polemical notion that anybody who's involved in the capitalist system is somehow corrupt and evil. You literally see no business people other than people who are exploitative or embezzling. Okay, I didn't like Parasite for this very reason because it seemed like sort of a brainless critique of capitalism. My critique of Parasite is that the poor people in Parasite are supposed to be sympathetic, but they literally do nothing right, and the rich people in Parasite are supposed to be bad and therefore worthy of punishment, and they literally don't do anything that is immoral in the course of the movie, like at all. And yet you're just supposed to assume that the rich people are bad and the poor people are somehow good. The same thing sort of holds true in this show. In this show, all of the poor people are perceived as sort of innately more noble than the people who are rich, even though the reality is that the poor people in the show, the main character is a derelict gambler. He's a bad guy. And so that's the political take on the show, and it seems like that is the message that is now being exported by the South Korean film industry. But overall, if you had to rate Squid Game in terms of watchability and sort of addictiveness, pretty good show. I would give it maybe a 7 out of 10. In terms of politics, I give it like a 1 out of 10, because again, the politics of it are so baseline Hollywood silly. They really make no level of actual sense. The good. Compelling, well acted, well produced, interesting. It's a beautiful looking show. The sets that they built for the various games are really intricate. They look really good. They're sort of oddly creepy. The most compelling episode is episode 6 because it really forces the characters to take stock of the fact that they essentially have to kill other people in order to get ahead. But again, as a metaphor for capitalism, it's very silly, but it's very emotionally affecting. The bad, politically asinine. Politically, it makes no sense at all. Somewhat predictable in terms of the twists and turns. Very, very bloody, like super bloody. So that they use some old film and TV tropes. So bad guys listen to classical music. This is just a reality of the world, as we all know, is that, and it means that the bad guys are listening to, classic old jazz.
You like jazz?
So those are the good and the bad.